Of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Luke chapter 12, beginning to read at verse 49. Jesus is speaking. I have come to set the world on fire, and I wish it were already burning. I have a terrible baptism of suffering ahead of me, and I am under a heavy burden until it is accomplished. Do you think I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I have come to divide people against each other. From now on, families will be split apart, 3 in favor of me, 2 against, or 2 in favor and 3 against. Father will be divided against son, and son against mother, father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Then Jesus turned to the crowd and said, when you see clouds beginning to form in the west, you say, here comes a shower, and you're right. When the south wind blows, you say, today will be a scorcher, and it is. You fools! You know how to interpret the weather signs of the earth and the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the present times. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Father, this is a difficult passage to read, let alone to preach on, but may we hear your voice in the challenging words of Jesus this morning. Amen. I'm going to begin this sermon with a meme, which I found recently, and end with a quote from Lectio 365 from this morning. The meme is challenging, and the quote is encouraging, and we need to hold two together. Here's the quote, the meme rather. Christians in Iran. If we evangelize, they will put us in prison, but we'll do it anyway. Christians in India. If we evangelize, the crowd will beat us to death, but we'll do it anyway. Christians in China, if we evangelize, they will forcibly take our body parts for organ transplants, but we will do it anyway. Christians in the United Kingdom, if we evangelize, we'll feel awkward, so we won't do it. Now, somewhat pointed and rather sweeping, and in the light of what we've heard about Falcon Camp, not universal, but there is a grain of truth in that quote, that meme. As well as highlighting the incredible courage of our brothers and sisters in countries where the faith is persecuted, it also reveals a contrast in attitudes concerning the priority God's people give to evangelism between us in the West and the churches in places where the faith is received as anything but good news. Now, in part, you could put our reluctance to evangelize down to our British Reserve. And it is true that some of the methods that are more popular, shall we say, across the pond, don't really go down too well here. But it's not completely to do with reserve. I rather suspect that our reticence, and I'm generalizing a little bit here, has to do with our belief, in this country at least, that good Christians shouldn't cause trouble. And if we do offend people with our faith sharing, then it's definitely our fault. In short, we spell the word love N-I-C-E. To be Christian is to be nice. Well, not according to Jesus, as our gospel passage shows all too starkly. His message is so radical that it turns worlds upside down, and it challenges any and all vested interests that would seek to corral and contain religious belief and practice in order to render it harmless and irrelevant. The passage is a wake-up call to those who want our faith to be private rather than personal, uncontroversial and undemanding. One opinion or lifestyle amongst many others, and therefore offensive to anyone, never offensive to anyone. There was a book some while ago, a sci-fi comedy book about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it was called. And in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Earth was classified as being mostly harmless. And I think if you were to classify Christianity in this country, in most people's thinking, it's mostly harmless. Yes, the church is there, but it doesn't bother us, so that's okay. But our passage is a wake-up call to us to go about it differently. It doesn't give us carte blanche. I want to be very clear about this. It does not give us carte blanche to be rude and dismissive of other people's faiths or lack of them, nor to be aggressive in our sharing of the good news. I sometimes cringe when I walk through Chester City Square at the vehemence and the anger in the voices of some of these well-meaning street preachers who seem to be wagging the finger and telling people about their eternal destiny without even knowing who they are. So it's not a carte blanche to just go out there and bash people and call it evangelism. And that's actually because this passage is less about method than it is about content. It's the other way round from when we usually talk about evangelism. Peter, for example, says, always be prepared to give an account of the hope you have within you, but do so with gentleness and respect. That's the method. But what Jesus is talking about mainly in this passage is content, what the gospel is all about. He's saying that his message is what it is and that it's going to upset people because of what it is. It's going to divide people. It's going to divide families. And it's going to get Jesus and his followers into trouble if they truly live and express this gospel message. Even though paradoxically, to truly express this message is to love others as we love ourselves. In Jesus' day, his message was offensive and controversial because he was challenging the various ways in which his fellow Jews were seeing the world and responding to its challenges. Their challenge was, how do you live when Rome's in charge? What do you do if you want to be faithful to God when these pagans are oppressing God's people? They knew from their scriptures that God had promised his people that he was going to do something about their captivity and slavery to sin, and he was going to deliver them from their enemies. But there were different ideas about what that then meant in terms of how do you live as a good believer. If you were a Pharisee, it meant religious purity and a strict keeping of God's law. The reason we're in trouble in the first place is because we broke God's law. Therefore, we need to keep the law and we need to invent other rules to make sure we're keeping the law. The trouble is, the Pharisees forgot what the law was for in the first place, which was to enable people to come to God and then for them to go to others in the welcome of God. And they ended up condemning those who didn't do things their way. If you're a Sadducee, then compromise was the name of the game. Something encouraged by the fact that if you're a Sadducee, you normally were wealthy and part of the aristocracy. And you were there because you were working with Rome rather than against them. Their belief was you kept on Rome's good side, and therefore the country could flourish up to a point. But this unfortunately meant that they were dismissive of their fellow Jews and indifferent to their suffering. The Zealots wanted holy war and saw violence as the way forward. And the Essenes, they said, a plague on all your houses. And they retreated into a holy huddle, confident that God would approve and sort things out in his own way. And Jesus' kingdom message cut across all of these alternatives. Jesus declared that God was on the move, that the kingdom was for everyone and not just the political or religious elite, and that the kingdom method was sacrificial love, and that faithfulness meant engagement with the world and not retreat from it. What's more, if you wanted to be in on what God was doing, you needed to be close to Christ, to Jesus. You needed to be his follower, putting him before all other loyalties and being prepared to surrender everything for his sake. Many of the passages in Luke that we've been looking at up till now contain cultural faux pas encouraged by Jesus, things that would have been shocking in his day, but which we tend not to notice because it's not part of our culture. The fact that family was not to be important, as was following Jesus, about not burying your father, but come follow me, all sorts of things that would have sent shockwaves through the society in which Jesus was living. And that's why his message stirred things up. It wasn't so much about religious debate as about a different way of living that went counter to the cultural expectations of God's people in those days. People got angry because Jesus was challenging their various solutions of dealing with their current dilemmas and was calling for them and demanding that they follow him. But at the heart of it was Jesus was undermining exclusivity. He was opening up God's family through his ministry to Israel to the whole world, which of course includes us. Right at the beginning of his ministry, when Jesus declared that the Spirit of the Lord was upon him to preach good news to the poor, he almost got himself lynched by saying that non-Jews were going to be included. And all the Gospels record the growing opposition Jesus encountered and endured as his ministry progressed. That where he went, he stirred things up. And this was a necessary stirring because the world needed radical transformation. Now, we live in a very different world where most of our neighbours don't think all that much about God, let alone speculate about how he is going to sort out our various crises. But those same neighbours get uncomfortable if followers of Jesus suggest that our current crises have as a root cause our nation's failure to give God his rightful place in both our personal lives and in our wider community, in the way we do things socially, communally, as well as privately. And discomfort turns to anger if you dare to suggest that Jesus is Lord, that governments, all governments, are answerable to him, and that his way of love, which means sacrifice for the other, is the non-negotiable necessity for fairness and flourishing in our common life. And God forbid we ever say anything of anything in public and private life that actually, yes, God does forbid. Now, this is very different problems to first century Palestine, but very similar responses when it comes to the message of Jesus and the message about him. And the challenge to those of us who follow Jesus and who therefore have to take on board the common hostility to our message that hasn't changed and therefore goes against the needing to be nice, is that if we want to be in what God is doing, we need to be keeping close to Christ. We need to be Jesus' followers. And that means putting him before all other loyalties and being prepared to sacrifice everything for his sake. This is not cultural Christianity. This is a revolutionary lifestyle, a way of living that both shows up the inadequacies of our common culture and challenges others to come follow him. My belief is that we have, in the main, as the church in the UK, allowed the world we live in to set the parameters of our faith and the rules by which we live it. We are constantly being told, it's okay to be a Christian, provided you keep it to yourself. We've been told that our faith is a private matter, and that we should not think that the teaching of Jesus should be applied to politics as well as to piety. And we've been told that it's unacceptable to say and to live the fact that Jesus is Lord, especially if we're saying he's Lord of everyone, no matter what their beliefs or lack of them. The basic belief of our nation, I think, can be summed up in the phrase that we can have the good life without a God life. And this being the case, a God life is a matter of personal choice, not universal need. But the good life without the God life has a shelf life. The basic belief of our world is wrong. And if we have any concern or love for our neighbours, our families sometimes, our friends, then we need to bring this to their attention. The way you think the world works isn't. The way the world runs, the way the world will be healed, the way humanity will be restored to its creational function and to the true joy and happiness that all of us are craving has to come by us, all of us, coming to Jesus. In our passage, Jesus can see what will be the outcome of his fellow Jews pursuing their agendas without regard to the truth about himself. And it happened. He prophesied that their nation would be destroyed and that their hopes would die. And that happened in AD 70, some 40 years after Jesus' death. They were failing to read the signs of the times, and it was going to prove fatal. Jesus' death and resurrection will be the necessary action of God, if any are to be saved. And yet Jesus' death will be brought about by those who oppose him, and his resurrection will be a sign that they were wrong and that God's new creation is breaking in, but it is centered on Jesus. And I would say our own generation isn't all that good at reading the signs of our times. There is still a belief and a hope that the good life is obtainable and that all our problems can be solved by our own efforts if we just find out the right way of doing it. Well, I don't think so. I'm not being pessimistic. I do believe there's a role for government and for leadership, and we should pray for such, because good can be done by those in power. But the idea that we can fix it permanently by ourselves is simply not the message of the Bible. God means for us to fix it, but in partnership with him and under his guidance and through the power of his Spirit. That is our calling. That is our vocation, is to look after the creation, but to do so with God, as it were, looking after us. The I can do it myself attitude, the sin of self-reliance, if you like, brings about some gain in terms of order and happiness, but at great cost, as we see when we look at the way our world is and what it costs the third world for us to have the comfortable life that we currently have. The real good life is only available through the God life Jesus supplies. His death and resurrection are the means by which God is restoring human beings to their God-given calling. And there is no other way that this can happen. Our response has to be to say yes to the lordship of Christ, not just to our belief in him as the Son of God. Yes to his gift of resurrection, which is to be lived and not simply to be believed. And yes to playing our part in God's new creation project, which was birthed on Easter Day and continues until its consummation when Christ returns, and in which we are summoned to play our part, which in part includes telling people about Jesus and inviting them to join in. I believe we have to use the language that our people around us understand, and that means abandoning many God words that we're quite happy with and commonly used within church. I've had a sweatshirt made, which I intend to use when I'm out and about in Chester, which says, Kingdom of God Recruitment Officer. Because that's language that people understand. Apostle, disciple, evangelist. These are all kind of words that are common in church, but don't really have much resonance or traction outside of Christian circles. But part of being part of God's new creation project is to be recruiting people into the family of God so they can find their worth, their value, who they are, and join in with the work of the kingdom. As I say to some people, God is inviting people to join his family, but it's a family business, and everybody plays their part within it. So ours is to be a lived project, a lived life, a lived faith, and a shared one. It's the one that we are commissioned to proclaim. And I believe, and we're looking at this in the church as a subgroup of the PCC, the mission group, which is looking at ways in which we can foster an evangelistic attitude and atmosphere within the life of our church, which does not mean that everybody stands up here and speaks to people like Billy Graham. It's much, much wider than that. But it's something our country needs us to be doing in this church and in others. I said I'd started with a meme that was challenging. I finished with a quote which is encouraging. And this was from this morning's Lectio 365, which is on Sundays, it's a Sabbath prayer. And this is what Pete Gregg said in the Lectio this morning. It's an astonishing thought that some 2 billion people will gather today to worship Jesus, from the rising of the sun to the place where it sets, celebrating together the story of God from creation to redemption, anticipating together its final chapter, its final thrilling chapter, and partaking together in its unfolding narrative. We are broken and imperfect, yet we are the largest, most diverse community on earth, an ancient global revolutionary movement conspiring to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to comfort all who mourn, fulfilling the mission and the mandate of our Master, Jesus Christ. May it be so.